Miguel had always known that winning Laura's love would be the easy part. What he hadn't anticipated was how hard it would be to gain her parents' approval. As he stood nervously at the front door of the grand estate where Laura grew up, his heart raced. He was about to enter a world that couldn't be more different from his own. The towering columns, the manicured gardens, the luxury cars parked outside. All of it was a reminder that he was an outsider in their world of wealth and privilege. But this dinner was important. It was the first time Laura's parents had agreed to meet him formally, and Miguel knew it was his chance to prove he was worthy of their daughter. As the door swung open, revealing the grand entryway, Miguel's eyes briefly met those of Laura's father, Carlos. The man's gaze was cold, calculating, and sharp. Without a word, he turned and walked inside, leaving Miguel to follow behind, feeling like a child out of place in an adult's world. Laura was already in the living room, her face lighting up when she saw him. She approached, wrapping her arms around him in a warm embrace, whispering reassuring words in his ear. "You've got this. Just be yourself," she said, though her eyes betrayed a hint of anxiety. Laura knew her parents, especially her father, better than anyone. She understood the kind of pressure Miguel was about to face. Dinner was a formal affair. The long dining table, decorated with fine china and sparkling crystal glasses, felt more like a display of wealth than a place to share a meal. Helena, Laura's mother, sat elegantly at the head of the table, her posture rigid and her smile barely concealing the disdain she felt for Miguel's presence. Carlos sat across from Miguel, his fingers tapping on the edge of his wine glass as he scrutinized the young man before him. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the sound of utensils lightly clinking against plates. Miguel could feel the tension rising, a knot forming in his stomach. He wasn't sure if it was the food or the anxiety, but he was struggling to keep himself composed. Then came the questions, thinly veiled judgments disguised as casual conversation. "So, Miguel," Carlos began, his voice dripping with condescension, "what exactly do you do for work? I'm sure it must be quite challenging to, make ends meet." Helena glanced at her husband with a smirk, her fingers daintily placing her wine glass back on the table, as if she was waiting for the response that would entertain her. Miguel swallowed hard. He knew this was coming. He had prepared for it, yet somehow the word stuck in his throat. "I'm an architect," Miguel replied simply, hoping to keep the conversation short and avoid deeper scrutiny. But Carlos was relentless. "An architect? Interesting. And you went to?" Miguel mentioned the name of his modest university, a clear contrast to the Ivy League institutions that Carlos had likely expected. The pause that followed was suffocating. Carlos nodded, though his expression made it clear that he was unimpressed. "I see," was all he said, his tone filled with quiet judgment. The evening dragged on, with Carlos and Helena taking subtle jabs at Miguel, each question a reminder that they believed he wasn't good enough for their daughter. Laura, seated beside Miguel, grew visibly tense as the conversation continued. She loved her parents, but she could no longer ignore how they were treating the man she wanted to spend her life with. Yet, for the sake of peace, she held her tongue, silently gripping Miguel's hand under the table. Her touch was his only comfort in that moment, the only thing grounding him amidst the wave of hostility. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room, where the mood was no lighter. Carlos poured himself a glass of brandy, offering none to Miguel as he motioned for him to sit. "So, Miguel," he began again, this time with a smug grin, "what are your future plans? How do you intend to support my daughter?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Miguel could feel all eyes on him, waiting for him to stumble, to confirm their beliefs that he was unfit for Laura. But Miguel wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Taking a deep breath, he met Carlos's gaze directly. "Laura and I have plans. We're going to build a future together. And I'm working on several projects that will set us up for success. I may not have what you have, but I'm dedicated, and I love your daughter. That's what really matters." His voice, though calm, carried a firmness that surprised even him. Carlos raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by Miguel's speech. "Love is important, but it doesn't pay the bills," he replied with a smirk, as Helena let out a soft, mocking laugh. Miguel felt his face flush. But before he could respond, Laura stood up, her face flushed with frustration. "Enough, Dad," she said, her voice trembling with both anger and hurt. "You don't get to belittle him like that." The room fell silent as Carlos looked at his daughter in surprise, clearly not expecting her to defend Miguel so openly. Miguel's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't wanted to cause any conflict, especially not between Laura and her family. But he also couldn't ignore the relief he felt knowing that she was on his side, willing to stand up for him, even against her own parents. The tension in the room was palpable, but Miguel knew that this was only the beginning. If he was going to marry Laura, he would have to face much more than disapproving looks and sharp words. The real battle was yet to come. The days leading up to the wedding were filled with a whirlwind of activity. Laura and Miguel had tried their best to focus on each other and the life they were building together, but the shadow of her parents' disapproval hung over every conversation and decision. The more they tried to plan their wedding, the more apparent it became that Carlos and Helena were not just uninterested in the union. They were actively working against it. While Laura imagined a simple and elegant ceremony, her parents insisted on grandeur and opulence, as if they were trying to compensate for what they saw as Miguel's shortcomings. Laura's parents had taken control of nearly every aspect of the wedding. The venue was set to be an extravagant estate owned by one of their wealthiest friends, a location that Miguel had never even heard of before. The guest list, which Laura had hoped would include only close family and friends, had ballooned into an affair packed with business associates, socialites, and dignitaries. People who barely knew the couple but were there to see and be seen. It was no longer about celebrating their love. It was about status, about showing the world that the daughter of Carlos and Helena was marrying, even if the groom didn't fit their high society mold. One evening, while reviewing the wedding plans, Laura sat across from Miguel in their small apartment. She looked frustrated, flipping through a stack of papers detailing the wedding arrangements that no longer resembled anything she had envisioned. "This isn't what I want, Miguel," she said, her voice weary. "My parents have turned our wedding into something unrecognizable. I feel like we're just pawns in some show they're putting on for their friends." Miguel, sitting beside her, could see the weight of it all bearing down on her. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll get through this," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure how. Miguel understood Laura's frustrations, but he also felt conflicted. He wanted to stand up for her, to fight for their vision of the wedding, but he knew that going against her parents could strain the relationship even more. And as much as he wanted to make a stand, he knew that his voice carried little weight in a family that had always seen him as inferior. "Maybe we should just go along with it," Miguel suggested softly. "It's just one day, right? What matters is that we're getting married. Everything else is just details." Laura's eyes flashed with emotion. "It's not just one day, Miguel," she said, shaking her head. "This is the beginning of our life together. If we let them control this, they'll keep controlling everything. They already think you're not good enough for me. They're turning our wedding into some sort of proof that they can fix my mistake by marrying you." Her words stung, not because they were aimed at him, but because they revealed the painful truth of the situation. Carlos and Helena saw Miguel as a flaw in their perfect world, and they were doing everything they could to polish over it. Despite the mounting tensions, Miguel continued to push through, trying his best to support Laura while also keeping the peace with her parents. He had always known that marrying into a family like hers would come with challenges, but he hadn't anticipated the depth of their prejudice. In their eyes, he was simply not enough, no matter how hard he worked or how much he loved their daughter. And yet, Miguel found strength in his love for Laura. He knew that if they could get through this, they could get through anything. As the wedding plans progressed, Miguel became increasingly aware of the stark contrast between his world and Laura's. One particular incident at a wedding planning meeting stuck with him. It was supposed to be a small gathering to discuss the menu, but Carlos had turned it into an opportunity to parade their wealth in front of Miguel. The meeting was held at an exclusive restaurant, the kind of place where the cost of a single meal was more than Miguel's monthly rent. As they sat around the table, Carlos casually discussed the different wine pairings and gourmet dishes as though it were everyday conversation. Miguel felt out of place, not because he didn't appreciate good food, but because it was clear that Carlos was using this as another way to make him feel small. "Do you have any preferences, Miguel?" Carlos asked, his tone polite but laced with condescension. "I'm sure you've had your share of fine dining experiences, right?" Miguel knew it was a trap, but he wasn't going to let Carlos get to him. "I'm more of a simple guy," Miguel replied, keeping his voice steady. "As long as the food is good and everyone's happy, that's what matters." Carlos smirked, clearly unimpressed with Miguel's response. "Well, we'll make sure to have something for every taste," he said, the subtle dig not lost on anyone at the table. Laura, sitting beside Miguel, bristled at her father's comment, but once again, she held her tongue. The tension between them was growing, and Miguel could feel the strain it was putting on Laura. She was caught between the love of her life and the family that had shaped her identity. One evening, after another exhausting day of wedding planning, Miguel and Laura sat on the couch in their apartment. The weight of the situation seemed to be pressing down on them, and for the first time, Miguel could see how much it was affecting Laura. She looked tired, defeated even. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Miguel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "We're almost there," he reassured her, though deep down he wondered if they truly were. The tension between Laura and her parents reached its peak a week before the wedding. Carlos, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, proposed a compromise to Miguel. He suggested that Miguel and Laura sign a prenuptial agreement to protect the family's assets. It was a blatant insult, and everyone knew it. By suggesting the prenup, Carlos was making it clear that he didn't trust Miguel, that he still saw him as someone who was after their money rather than someone who genuinely loved their daughter. Miguel was furious, but he kept his composure. He didn't want to escalate things, especially not with the wedding so close. But the damage had been done. Laura, overhearing the conversation, was livid. "How dare you?" she shouted at her father, her voice shaking with anger. "You have no right to suggest something like that. Miguel isn't with me for money, and you know it." Carlos, taken aback by his daughter's outburst, tried to backpedal, but the damage was done. Laura stormed out of the room, with Miguel following close behind. That night, as they sat together in their apartment, Laura made a decision. "We're going to do this our way," she said firmly. "This wedding isn't about them. It's about us. If they can't accept that, then they don't have to be there." Miguel nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time, it felt like they were taking control of their own story. They would no longer be the pawns in Carlos and Helena's game. As the days drew closer to the wedding, a sense of unease settled over Miguel. He could feel the growing tension, not just between Laura and her parents, but within himself. Despite their best efforts to take control of the wedding, Miguel knew that Carlos wasn't finished with his attempts to undermine him. There was still something looming, something that made Miguel feel like he was being set up for a final test. One last hurdle before Carlos would stop interfering in their lives. The wedding was supposed to be a joyous occasion, yet it had become a battlefield where every word, every decision was scrutinized by Laura's family. Miguel's suspicions were confirmed one evening when Laura's father called him, asking him to meet privately for a talk. Miguel didn't want to go, but something in Carlos's tone made it clear that this wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. Reluctantly, Miguel agreed, knowing full well that whatever Carlos had planned wasn't going to be pleasant. Laura, sensing Miguel's anxiety, tried to reassure him. "Whatever he says, it doesn't matter," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We're getting married, and that's all that counts." But Miguel knew that this meeting was about more than just words. Carlos was the kind of man who didn't let go easily, and Miguel needed to be prepared. The meeting took place at one of Carlos's private clubs, a place that Miguel had never set foot in before. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of cigar smoke and polished leather, a world of wealth and power that felt completely foreign to him. As Miguel entered the room, he was greeted by the sight of Carlos sitting comfortably in an oversized chair, a glass of whiskey in hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way he looked at Miguel that set him on edge. This wasn't just a casual conversation. This was a test, and Miguel was about to find out just how far Carlos was willing to go to protect what he saw as his family's legacy. Carlos wasted no time in getting to the point. "Miguel," he began, his voice smooth but cold, "I've given this a lot of thought, and I've come to a decision." He paused, as if savoring the power he held in that moment. "I want what's best for my daughter. I want her to have a life of security, of comfort, of luxury. And while I understand that she loves you, I need to know that you're capable of giving her that life." Carlos leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Miguel's. "So, I've arranged a small challenge for you. Consider it a final test of sorts." Miguel's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of challenge?" he asked, though he already knew that whatever it was, it wouldn't be fair. Carlos smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I've invited a few of my business associates to a dinner tomorrow night," he explained. "It's nothing formal, just a gathering of some of the most influential people in my circle. I want you to join us. I want to see how you handle yourself in their company. It's important, Miguel, that you understand the kind of people Laura and I are accustomed to being around." Miguel could feel the trap closing in around him, but he nodded, knowing that he didn't have a choice. This wasn't just a test of his ability to fit in with Laura's family. It was an opportunity for Carlos to humiliate him, to show him once and for all that he didn't belong in their world. As Miguel left the club that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what he did, it wouldn't be enough. Carlos had already made up his mind, and this dinner was just a formality. But Miguel wasn't about to give up. He loved Laura, and if this was the price he had to pay to prove it, then he would face it head on. The following evening, Miguel found himself walking into yet another grand, opulent setting, a stark contrast to the simple life he was used to. The dinner was held at a private estate, the kind of place where everything from the decor to the silverware screamed wealth and status. As he entered the room, he was greeted by the sight of Carlos and his associates already seated, their eyes immediately turning to him. The conversation, which had been light and jovial, fell silent as Miguel approached the table. Carlos, ever the gracious host, stood up and gestured for Miguel to sit. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "this is Miguel, my future son-in-law." Miguel could feel the weight of their gazes as he took his seat. These were men of power, men who had spent their entire lives accumulating wealth and influence. To them, Miguel was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in their carefully curated world. The dinner began, and for a while, the conversation flowed around Miguel without involving him. Carlos's friends spoke of business deals, international investments, and private clubs that Miguel had never heard of. He listened quietly, trying to absorb as much as he could, but it was clear that he was being deliberately excluded from the discussion. After a while, Carlos turned to Miguel, a smile playing on his lips. "Miguel," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth, "why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? I'm sure my friends would love to hear about the work you're doing." Miguel swallowed, knowing that this was yet another trap. Carlos wasn't asking out of genuine interest. He was setting him up for failure. But Miguel wasn't going to back down. He took a deep breath and began to speak, explaining his work as an architect and the projects he was involved in. He kept his tone steady, trying not to let the tension show in his voice. As he spoke, he could feel the eyes of the men around him, their expressions unreadable but filled with judgment. They listened politely, but it was clear that they weren't impressed. When Miguel finished, there was a brief, awkward silence before one of the men, a tall, thin man with a sharp smile, leaned forward. "Architecture, huh?" he said, his voice light but condescending. "That's an interesting field. Of course, it's not exactly the most lucrative, is it? Not compared to what we do, anyway." The others chuckled softly, and Miguel felt a flush of anger rise in his chest. But he kept his cool, refusing to let them see how much their words affected him. Carlos, sensing the shift in the room, quickly changed the subject, steering the conversation back to safer territory. But the damage had been done. Miguel knew that no matter what he said or did, he would always be seen as the poor man who wasn't good enough for their world. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small talk and laughter, but Miguel couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy that had settled over him. As the dinner came to an end, Carlos pulled him aside, his expression unreadable. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, though there was no real praise in his voice. "But remember, this is the world Laura belongs to. If you want to be a part of it, you'll have to do better." Miguel left the estate that night feeling more determined than ever. He knew that Carlos and his friends would never accept him, but that didn't matter. What mattered was Laura, and the life they were going to build together. The test had been grueling, but it had only strengthened Miguel's resolve. He would marry Laura, no matter what her family thought. And when the time came, he would show them all that he was more than they had ever given him credit for. The night before the wedding arrived with a mix of excitement, anxiety, and uncertainty. The events of the past few weeks had left Miguel exhausted, both emotionally and mentally. The final test orchestrated by Carlos was still fresh in his mind, and although he had survived the dinner, the unspoken judgment of Laura's father and his powerful friends weighed heavily on him. But tomorrow would be the start of something new, a day that would solidify his love for Laura, despite the obstacles her family had thrown in their path. He had made it this far, and now, with just hours left before their wedding, Miguel allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Laura was pacing the room in their apartment, her phone buzzing incessantly with last-minute texts and updates from wedding planners, vendors, and even her parents. Her usual calm demeanor was stretched thin, the stress of the upcoming ceremony getting the best of her. "I can't believe how much there is left to do," she muttered, her eyes scanning through a long checklist. "Every little detail, it's overwhelming." Miguel watched her from across the room, knowing that her frustration was about more than just the wedding logistics. She was battling the weight of her parents' expectations, the unspoken pressure to have a perfect day, a day that wasn't entirely hers. "Let's take a break," Miguel suggested gently, walking over to her and placing a hand on her shoulder. "We've done everything we can. Tomorrow we get married, and that's all that matters. The rest is just noise." Laura looked at him, her eyes softening. She knew he was right, but it wasn't easy to let go of the pressure. For so long, she had tried to please everyone, balancing the love she had for Miguel with the loyalty she felt toward her family. But now, on the brink of marrying the man she loved, Laura was beginning to realize that no matter what her parents thought, this was her life to live. They sat together on the couch, the wedding planning forgotten for the moment. Miguel took Laura's hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice thoughtful, "about us, about this wedding, about everything that's happened. It hasn't been easy, but I wouldn't change any of it. It's brought us closer, and I know that no matter what happens tomorrow, we'll be okay. We've faced so much already, and we've come out stronger." Laura nodded, her head resting on his shoulder. "I know," she whispered. "I just wish things had been different with my parents. I wish they could see you the way I see you." Miguel smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I've accepted that they may never see me that way. But it doesn't matter, Laura. What matters is that we see each other, that we know what we mean to each other. Your parents, they're set in their ways. I can't change that. But I can give you the life you deserve, a life built on love, respect, and understanding. And that's what we'll have." Laura looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. In that moment, she knew that no amount of disapproval from her parents could ever shake the foundation she and Miguel had built together. As the night stretched on, Laura drifted off to sleep, but Miguel remained awake, his mind racing with thoughts of the wedding day ahead. He couldn't help but think of the ceremony, of the moment when he would stand before Laura's family, friends, and a sea of strangers, making his vows. The pressure was immense, not because he doubted his love for Laura, but because he knew that this was his moment to prove, not just to her parents, but to everyone watching, that he was worthy of her. He had always felt like an outsider, an imposter in the world of wealth and privilege that Laura came from. But tomorrow, he would show them all who he really was. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, a perfect day by all accounts. The estate where the ceremony was to be held was nothing short of breathtaking, with sprawling gardens, elegant fountains, and a grand ballroom that seemed to glitter with anticipation. Guests began to arrive early, their expensive cars lining the driveway as they stepped out in their finest attire. Miguel arrived separately from Laura, as was tradition, but the moment he stepped onto the estate grounds, he felt the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. Carlos and Helena were already there, greeting guests with the kind of practiced smiles that came from years of navigating high society. When they saw Miguel, their expressions didn't change. Carlos gave a curt nod, while Helena offered a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. Miguel knew what they were thinking. To them, this was nothing more than a formality, a spectacle that would end in disappointment. But Miguel wasn't here for them. He was here for Laura, and that was all that mattered. As the time for the ceremony approached, Miguel found himself standing alone in a small room off to the side of the main garden where the wedding would take place. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. The weight of the past weeks, of the relentless judgment from Laura's parents and their circle, hung heavy on him. But he knew that this was his moment to rise above it. He wasn't marrying Laura to prove something to her family. He was marrying her because he loved her, and that love was stronger than any disapproval or prejudice they could throw at him. The sound of music drifting through the air signaled that the ceremony was about to begin. Miguel made his way to the garden, where rows of chairs were set up facing a beautifully decorated altar. As he stood at the front, waiting for Laura, his heart pounded in his chest. The guests were all seated, their eyes focused on him, but Miguel blocked out their stares. His mind was solely on Laura and the life they were about to begin together. And then she appeared. Laura walked down the aisle, radiant in her wedding dress, her face a mixture of joy and nervousness. Miguel's breath caught in his throat as he watched her approach, each step bringing her closer to him. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the judgmental looks from her parents, not the whispers of the guests, not the pressure of the day. All that mattered was Laura and the love they shared. When she finally reached him, they stood together, hand in hand, facing the officiant. The ceremony began, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, Miguel felt a sense of peace wash over him. This was it. This was the moment they had fought for, the moment that would mark the beginning of their life together. As the officiant spoke, Miguel found himself lost in thought, reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. When it came time for the vows, Miguel turned to Laura, his heart swelling with emotion. He looked into her eyes, the weight of his words heavy on his tongue. "Laura," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've loved you from the moment I met you. You've shown me what it means to truly care for someone, to stand by them through every challenge, every obstacle. And today, I promise you that I will spend the rest of my life loving you, supporting you, and building a future together. No matter what comes our way, I will always be by your side." As he spoke, he could feel the eyes of everyone in the audience on him. But for once, it didn't matter. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away from him. The moment hung in the air as Miguel finished his vows. The garden had fallen into a profound silence, with every guest intently watching him. It was as if the world had paused, the wind stilling, and the birds ceasing their songs. Miguel's words had come from the deepest part of him, unfiltered and raw. In the midst of it all, Carlos and Helena sat at the front, their expressions unreadable. They had expected the typical, perhaps even nervous, speech of a man who didn't belong in their world. But instead, Miguel had spoken with a quiet confidence that had silenced even the most judgmental of their friends. His sincerity had stunned them. Laura's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto Miguel's. His words had reached her heart in a way she hadn't anticipated, and as she looked at him, standing there in front of her with so much love in his eyes, she knew without a doubt that she had made the right choice. The weight of her parents' disapproval, of the societal pressures that had hung over them for so long, seemed to vanish in that moment. It was just her and Miguel, standing together in the truth of their love. She smiled, blinking back tears, and mouthed the words, "I love you." The officiant cleared his throat gently, bringing everyone back to the present. "And now, Laura, it is your turn to say your vows." Laura took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had prepared her vows weeks ago, but in this moment, the carefully written words seemed inadequate. Instead, she spoke from the heart, her voice clear and unwavering. "Miguel," she began, her eyes locked on his, "I knew from the moment I met you that you were different, not because of where you came from, but because of who you are. You've shown me what it means to love unconditionally, to stand by someone even when things get hard. You've been my rock, my confidant, and my best friend. Today, I promise you that I will always stand by your side through every challenge, every triumph. I love you more than words can express, and I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you." The audience, previously so full of judgment and skepticism, seemed to soften in the wake of Laura's words. A murmur of approval rippled through the guests, many of whom had come expecting to witness a spectacle of sorts, a mismatch between a rich girl and a poor boy, a wedding doomed from the start. But what they saw now was different. There was no doubt that Miguel and Laura were deeply in love, and that love was powerful enough to transcend the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. As Laura finished her vows, the officiant smiled warmly. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Miguel and Laura didn't need any further prompting. They leaned into each other, their lips meeting in a kiss that was sweet and tender, yet filled with the promise of a future they would build together. The guests erupted into applause, though Miguel barely noticed. All that mattered was Laura and the life they had just vowed to share. But as the cheers and applause swelled around them, Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The ceremony had been beautiful, yes, but the challenges that lay ahead still loomed large. He could feel the eyes of Carlos on him, a reminder that, in the eyes of Laura's father, the battle wasn't over. Miguel had won this round, but there were still obstacles to overcome, still judgments to face. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of peace, a moment to simply enjoy the fact that he and Laura were finally married. As the ceremony concluded and the guests began to make their way to the reception area, Carlos approached Miguel. There was a brief pause, the tension between them palpable. Carlos's expression was carefully neutral, but Miguel could see the flicker of something else in his eyes, something like begrudging respect. "You surprised me today," Carlos said, his voice low but measured. "I wasn't expecting that." Miguel met his gaze evenly. "I'm not here to impress you, Carlos. I'm here because I love your daughter. That's all that matters to me." Carlos's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "We'll see about that," he muttered under his breath before turning and walking away. It wasn't a victory, but it was enough for Miguel to know that he had at least made Carlos pause. That, in itself, was a step forward. The reception was held in a grand ballroom, a continuation of the opulence that had defined the entire wedding. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over the elegantly decorated tables. Guests mingled, champagne glasses in hand, as they discussed the unexpected beauty of the ceremony. Many of them had come with doubts about the match between Miguel and Laura, but those doubts seemed to have been quelled, at least for now. As the night progressed, Miguel found himself standing on the balcony, looking out over the estate's vast gardens. The cool evening air was a welcome relief from the heat of the ballroom, and he took a deep breath, savoring the quiet moment. His mind drifted back to the dinner with Carlos and his friends, the challenge he had faced and the subtle, cutting remarks that had followed. He had passed that test, but there would always be more. He knew that marrying Laura didn't mean the end of the judgments. It was only the beginning. Laura joined him on the balcony, slipping her hand into his. "Hey," she said softly, resting her head on his shoulder. "You okay?" Miguel smiled, though there was a heaviness in his eyes. "Yeah," he replied. "It's just a lot to take in. Today was perfect, but I can't help feeling like there's still so much ahead of us." Laura nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I know. My parents, they're not going to change overnight, but we'll face it together, okay? Whatever comes next, we'll deal with it, just like we've dealt with everything else." Miguel wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I don't care what they think anymore," he said, his voice firm. "All I care about is you. As long as we have each other, we can handle whatever comes our way." Laura smiled up at him, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "Today is just the beginning. We're going to build a life together, and nothing and no one can take that away from us." As they stood there, the distant sound of laughter and music drifting through the night, Miguel realized something important. He had spent so long worrying about what Laura's parents thought of him, about whether he was good enough in their eyes. But now, as he stood with his wife in his arms, he knew that none of that mattered. What mattered was the love they shared, the bond they had built, that was stronger than any judgment, any disapproval. And as long as they held on to that, they would be okay. The reception continued late into the night, with guests dancing, toasting, and celebrating the union of Miguel and Laura. As the evening wore on, the atmosphere shifted from formal and grand to relaxed and joyful. For the first time since the planning of the wedding had begun, Miguel felt like he could breathe. The weight of the expectations, the judgments, the pressures, they all seemed to fade away as he and Laura danced together, surrounded by the people who truly cared about them. As the night came to a close, Miguel looked around the room, taking it all in. This was their moment, their celebration. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel a sense of pride, not for proving anyone wrong, but for standing tall in the face of adversity and fighting for the love that mattered most. The following days after the wedding were a whirlwind of emotions. While the ceremony had been a beautiful, touching moment for both Miguel and Laura, the lingering presence of her parents' disapproval remained a shadow over their new marriage. Miguel had thought that perhaps the sincerity of his vows, the depth of his love for Laura, might have softened Carlos and Helena's views. But as the newlyweds settled into their first few days as husband and wife, the reality of their situation began to set in. They had moved into a modest apartment, a place that reflected their decision to start their life together on their own terms. It wasn't the sprawling estate that Laura had grown up in, but it was theirs. For Miguel, it was the first time he felt like they were free from the constraints of her family's expectations. Here, in their small space, they could create their own future, one not dictated by wealth or status, but by the love they shared. But even within the walls of their new home, the tension remained. One morning, as they sat together at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and talking about their plans for the future, a familiar ringtone interrupted the peaceful moment. Laura glanced at her phone and sighed. "It's my mother," she said, hesitating before answering the call. Miguel watched her, knowing that every interaction with her parents was a reminder that they had not fully accepted him. Laura answered, her voice polite but distant, and as the conversation unfolded, Miguel could tell by her expression that it wasn't going well. When Laura hung up, she was visibly upset. "They're still trying to control everything," she said, shaking her head in frustration. "My mother thinks we should move into one of their properties. She says it would be more appropriate for someone in my position. They still don't understand that I don't want that life anymore." Miguel reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," he reminded her gently. "But we have to stay strong. This is our life now, not theirs." Laura nodded, but Miguel could see the strain in her eyes. Her love for him was unwavering, but the pressure from her family was taking its toll. Every call, every comment was a reminder that in their eyes, she had married beneath her. And while Laura was determined to stand by Miguel, The weight of her parents' judgment was something neither of them could escape completely. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Laura and her parents continued to build. They visited occasionally, always under the guise of concern, but their true motives were clear. Carlos, in particular, never missed an opportunity to remind Miguel that he wasn't what they had envisioned for their daughter. It was subtle. Comments about their apartment, their lifestyle, or casual references to the kind of life Laura could have had if she had chosen someone more suitable. Miguel did his best to brush it off, but the constant drip of disapproval was wearing on him. One evening, after another difficult visit from her parents, Laura broke down. She sat on the edge of their bed, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Miguel sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," she whispered, her voice filled with exhaustion. "They just won't stop. They keep trying to tear us apart, to make me doubt everything." Miguel held her tightly, his heart breaking for her. "I know it's hard," he said softly, "but we can't let them win. We have to keep fighting for us." Despite the challenges, Miguel refused to give up. He had come too far to let Carlos and Helena's disdain destroy the life he and Laura were building together. But he also knew that something needed to change. They couldn't keep living under the constant scrutiny of her parents. Miguel began to think about how they could distance themselves from the toxic influence of Laura's family without completely cutting ties. It was a delicate balance. Laura loved her parents, despite everything, and Miguel didn't want to be the reason she became estranged from them. It was during one of these contemplative moments that Miguel came up with an idea. He and Laura had always dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world together, free from the pressures of work and family expectations. What if they took some time away, just the two of them, a chance to escape, to reconnect, and to put some distance between themselves and her parents' constant interference? When he brought the idea up to Laura, her eyes lit up for the first time in weeks. "That sounds perfect," she said, her voice filled with relief. "I think we really need this. Just you and me, away from everything." They began to plan their trip, excited for the chance to start fresh in a new place, even if only for a little while. It was a way for them to take control of their lives again, to remind themselves of why they had fought so hard to be together in the first place. As they packed their bags and prepared for their journey, Miguel couldn't help but feel a sense of optimism. This trip was exactly what they needed, an opportunity to leave behind the negativity and start focusing on their future. But even as they boarded the plane and the city faded into the distance, Miguel knew that the battle with Laura's parents wasn't over. It was merely on hold. The real challenge would come when they returned, and they would have to face Carlos and Helena once again. The weeks they spent traveling were like a dream. They explored new places, experienced different cultures, and most importantly, they rediscovered the joy of being together without the weight of outside expectations. For the first time in what felt like forever, Miguel and Laura were free to simply be themselves. They laughed, they talked, and they felt even deeper in love with each passing day. The pressures of her family seemed a world away, and for a while, they allowed themselves to forget about the struggles waiting for them back home. But as their trip came to an end, reality began to creep back in. The day before they were set to return, Laura received a message from her mother. It was brief but pointed. "We need to talk when you get back. There are things we need to discuss." Laura showed the message to Miguel, her expression one of weary resignation. "They're not going to let this go," she said quietly. Miguel nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll face it together," he replied. "Whatever they throw at us, we'll handle it. We've made it this far, and we're not going to back down now." When they returned home, it didn't take long for Carlos and Helena to arrange a meeting. They invited Miguel and Laura to dinner, and although neither of them wanted to go, they knew it was inevitable. They couldn't avoid this confrontation forever. The dinner was held at the same estate where their wedding had taken place, a reminder of the world Laura had come from and the expectations that still hung over her. As they sat around the dinner table, the atmosphere was tense. Carlos and Helena were polite, but there was an undercurrent of tension in every word they spoke. The conversation started off light, but it wasn't long before Carlos brought up the subject that had been weighing on everyone's minds. "Laura," he began, his voice measured, "your mother and I have been concerned about the choices you've been making lately. We understand that you and Miguel are trying to build a life together, but we believe you're not thinking about the long term. The way you're living now, it's not sustainable." Laura bristled, but before she could respond, Miguel spoke up. "With all due respect, Carlos, Laura and I are happy with the life we're building. It may not be the life you envision for her, but it's the life we've chosen, and we're not asking for your approval." Carlos's eyes narrowed, his mouth tightening into a thin line. "I see," he said coolly. "So you're telling me that you're content with this?" He gestured vaguely around him, as if the idea of living a modest life was something he couldn't comprehend. Miguel didn't flinch. "Yes, I am, because what matters to us isn't the size of our house or the amount of money in our bank account. What matters is that we love each other, that we're building something real together. I understand that may be hard for you to accept, but that's the truth." For a moment, the table was silent. Miguel could feel the weight of Carlos's gaze, but he didn't look away. He had said what needed to be said, and there was no going back now. The tension at the dinner table was palpable. Miguel had just spoken words that hung in the air, challenging Carlos and Helena in a way that no one had dared to before. Laura sat beside him, her heart racing, her hands clenched tightly under the table. She had known this confrontation was inevitable, but it didn't make it any easier. The silence in the room was suffocating, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Carlos, his face expressionless, stared across the table at Miguel, clearly processing what had just been said. Helena, sitting beside her husband, was the first to break the silence. "Miguel, I don't think you understand what we're trying to say," she began, her tone soft but condescending. "It's not about whether you two love each other. We've never doubted that. But love alone doesn't pay the bills. It doesn't provide the kind of life Laura deserves, the kind of life she was raised to have." Her words were like a knife, cutting deep into the heart of what this battle was really about. It wasn't about love. It was about status, about control, about the life that Carlos and Helena had always imagined for their daughter. Miguel sat quietly for a moment, considering his next words carefully. He could feel Laura tense beside him, ready to jump in, but he gently placed his hand on hers, signaling that he would handle it. "I understand what you're saying, Helena," Miguel began, his voice calm but firm. "But what you and Carlos seem to forget is that Laura isn't a child anymore. She's a grown woman who can make her own decisions about the life she wants to live. And she's chosen me. We may not have the kind of wealth or status that you're used to, but that doesn't mean we're incapable of building a happy, fulfilling life together." Carlos leaned forward, his face hardening. "And what kind of life are you planning to build exactly?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "Because from where I'm sitting, all I see is a man who's going to struggle to provide. You think love is enough? Let me tell you something, Miguel, love fades. And when it does, what are you left with? Nothing. You'll be left in the same position you are now, scrambling to make ends meet, while my daughter suffers for your pride." Miguel's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. He had expected this, had prepared himself for Carlos's cutting words. "I'm not scrambling, Carlos," Miguel said, meeting his gaze head-on. "I'm building. It may not look like much to you right now, but Laura and I are working together to create something meaningful. I'm an architect, and I'm proud of the work I do. It may not bring in millions overnight, but it's honest work and it's fulfilling. I'm not ashamed of where I come from, and I'm not afraid of hard work. What I am afraid of is letting other people dictate how we should live our lives." Laura, unable to hold back any longer, finally spoke up. "Dad, Mom, I love you both, but you have to stop this. You're not helping. Every time you criticize Miguel, every time you try to undermine our choices, it just pushes me further away. We're happy, and that should be enough for you. I don't want a life where everything is measured by how much money we have or who we know. I want a life built on love, trust, and respect. And if you can't support that, then maybe we need some distance." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time that night, Carlos and Helena seemed genuinely taken aback. The idea of losing their daughter, of pushing her so far that she would choose to distance herself from them, was something they hadn't considered. Carlos's face softened slightly, and for a moment, he looked like a man who had realized he was on the verge of losing something precious. "Laura," he began, his voice quieter than before, "we don't want to push you away. We just want what's best for you." Laura shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "What's best for me is to be with the man I love. What's best for me is to have your support, not your control. I need you to let me live my life the way I choose. Please, Dad, Mom, let us be happy." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Helena looked down at her hands, unable to meet her daughter's eyes, while Carlos seemed to be grappling with the weight of his own pride. Miguel remained quiet, allowing Laura to take the lead. This was her family, her battle to fight. He had said his piece, and now it was up to them to decide how they wanted to proceed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Carlos let out a long sigh. "Maybe we have been too hard on you," he admitted, his voice strained. "Maybe we haven't given Miguel a fair chance." He glanced at Miguel, the tension still present but softened. "I don't understand your choices, Miguel. I don't agree with them, but I can see that Laura loves you, and if that's what makes her happy, then I suppose I'll have to try to accept it." It wasn't a grand declaration of approval, but it was a start. Miguel could feel the shift in the room, the small crack in the wall that Carlos and Helena had built around their expectations. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was enough for now. Laura smiled through her tears, squeezing Miguel's hand as relief washed over her. As the dinner came to an end, Carlos and Helena bid them goodbye with less formality than usual. It was clear that this wouldn't be the last difficult conversation they would have, but for the first time, there was a sense of hope, a possibility that, with time, they could find common ground. On the drive home, Laura leaned her head against Miguel's shoulder, her exhaustion evident. "That was intense," she murmured, her voice soft. Miguel smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Yeah, it was, but I think we made progress. It's not going to be easy, but at least they're starting to come around." Laura nodded, her eyes closing as she let the tension of the evening melt away. "Thank you," she whispered, "for standing by me, for fighting for us. I don't know what I'd do without you." Miguel's heart swelled with love as he held her close. "You'll never have to find out," he promised. "We're in this together, no matter what." As they pulled into the driveway of their small apartment, the future stretched out before them, uncertain, yes, but filled with possibility. They had fought hard to get to this point, and though the road ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, they knew they could face it together. Miguel looked at their modest home, a symbol of the life they were building, and felt a sense of pride and contentment. This was their life, on their terms, and no amount of disapproval or judgment could take that away from them. That night, as they lay in bed, Miguel thought about the journey they had been on, the obstacles they had faced, the battles they had fought, and the love that had carried them through it all. He knew that their story was just beginning, that there would be more tests, more moments of doubt. But for now, in the quiet of their home, with Laura by his side, Miguel allowed himself to believe in the power of their love. It had brought them this far, and it would carry them forward, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care.